But you'd never know that. You'd never know that, because most of what we know about crime, for all of those of you who don't say, hot damn, I got my new copy of the UCRs, is what we get from the media. And what we get from the media gives us a very different perception of what reality is about, and particularly what most whites know about black people. They don't know from working next to them or living next to them or eating dinner with them. They know from what they get from the media. Now, when we look at the world, we have to develop shorthand ways of organizing all of the vast amount of information that we get. And so we have stereotypes that enable us to organize complex social experiences. And news is a way of constructing the reality for us, and newsmakers share those stereotypes, and they use those stereotypes as a way of enabling people to understand the world. And frames provide us with ways of interpreting our social phenomena, so that as we have an input of information, we can see, well, there's a lot of crime, and we could either say bad people making bad choices, or why is it that all of the crime is located in particular areas, and therefore what are the social structural forces determining the distribution of crime in the community. Now, the media portrayals prime our racial stereotypes, and they support conservative interpretations of crime, because media coverage of crime distorts reality, reinforces racial stereotypes, and supports get tough policies. They don't do it on purpose. It just sort of happens because they are an industry that operates by selling audiences to advertisers. And in order for them to sell audiences to advertisers, they have to attract audiences. And in order to attract audiences, they have to have something entertaining. So we have this action news format. And if it bleeds, it leads, right? Because that's going to be what's going to really help get all of the viewers. Now, to say if it bleeds, it leads is to say that news coverage has a particular script in its depiction of crime. Two components. Crime is violent, and the usual suspect is a minority perpetrator. And the combination of crime is violent and the perpetrator is a minority offender reinforces racial stereotypes, affects public opinion, and increases susceptibility to political claims makers and to punitive policies. The first proposition of the crime script. I mean, so you go home and you watch your news tonight. First thing you'll see is, the violent crime. You get the talking head saying, terrible crime. Then we cut to the scene and they describe, they'll interview some victims, and then we'll talk to a police official, and then we'll have a description of the perpetrator, or maybe we'll have the perpetrator already in custody. That's the crime script. Crime is violent. We have excessive coverage of crime. I mean, 25% of all local news coverage is about murder. I mean, murder is less than 1% of crime, but it's 25% of the amount of time your local news people are covering it. And in the 1990s, murder is down by 1/3. Crime news coverage is up 473%. So even as it's dropping off the face of the earth, we're focusing more on it. And when we cover it, we're going to emphasize the most unusual kinds of homicide. Homicide between strangers, even though homicide among acquaintances and intimates is the majority of all of the homicide we deal with. So we get this misleading and fearful perception of reality. The other part of the problem of just sort of the coverage of crime and the overemphasis on crime is that crime coverage tends to be episodic rather than contextual. That is to say, here's a murder, here's a murder, here's a murder, without any effort to say, well, here's a murder in the census tract, here's a murder in the same census tract, here's a third murder in the census tract. What is it about the conditions in this census tract that is conducive to homicide? right? So by dealing with it episodically rather than contextually, we reinforce the policy frame that it's bad people making bad choices rather than there's some sort of social structural phenomenon going on in particular venues. And it's in part because news production occurs in urban venues, and that skews coverage because the local news producers are going to focus on, that which is available. And crime news stories are sort of, they cut across the metro area in the same way that sports does, in the same way that weather does, in the same way that disaster does, so that they're all part of the package of attracting our audiences. Now, the other part of the problem is, as I said before, we've had this migration of blacks from the rural south to the urban north. So not only are the news producers in the cities, but also blacks are in the cities. And the police departments are the only people who are open 24 hours a day, and their spokesmen are always available to comment on crime. And the police have various incentives to emphasize violent crime, because they have higher clearance rates on violent crime, and by reinforcing our fear, they can get greater budgetary allocations, which is something every good bureaucrat wants. And politicians generate news on crime too, because they also have a variety of electoral incentives. The second part of the problem of the media is not just the distortion of reality, but also the distortion of perpetrators, that the usual suspects are black. Now, it's true blacks commit violent crimes at rates higher than do whites, but the coverage on the media disproportionately overemphasizes the relative contribution of black perpetrators to the overall volume of crime, and particularly if you get interracial crime. News folks' best story is, black male attacks a white female suburban. I mean, it doesn't get any better than that. Sort of victimness is one of the determinants of newsworthiness. So that we've got our perception of reality is the overemphasis on violence, the overemphasis on blacks, which reinforce prejudices and affect the susceptibility to political claims about the appropriate responses to crime, which is punishment. Okay? So now we start narrowing in on how this framework has affected our juvenile justice policies. And the crackdown on youth crime of the 1990s really reflects the politicization of crime politics, of crime policies over the past 3 decades, and the ways in which the media have shaped popular culture. For 3 decades, the conservative frame has dominated our perceptions of reality. That even in the 1950s, when we were dealing with the issues of civil rights and civil rights demonstrations, it was always those local southern sheriffs talking about, the communists and outside agitators coming down and stirring up our local contented folk. And that was really the beginning of the linkage in popular and political discourse of the relationship between crime and race. And that all of these issues of crime and policy and race have created divisions within the Democratic Party that began emerging in 1948, but really came to the fore in the 1960s between racial and social policy liberals and conservatives. And it was during the turbulent 1960s that we saw this crisis of law and order. And when we had the crisis of law and order, baby boom crime rates, urban riots, the Republicans blamed the Warren Court and all of these liberal policies for everything that was going wrong in American society. In 1964, again, I keep coming back to this 1964 to 1968, because in 1964, Lyndon Johnson ran against Barry Goldwater, and Lyndon Johnson had sponsored the Civil Rights Act, and Barry Goldwater opposed it, that blacks shouldn't have federally mandated access to hotels and restaurants and public transportation and the like. And in that election, the Democrats won an electoral landslide. They had a supermajority. They had more than 2/3 of the House and the Senate, so that they were able to enact all of these progressive social policies.